Good morning and welcome. My name is David Andreozzi. I'm an architect and the president of the New England chapter of the ICAA, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. I want to start this morning by thanking everyone here at the Boston Design Center for whom we've shared a long alliance with. This year, together, we've created a series of lectures titled the Architecture Series. It starts today with Richard Cameron to discuss his ambitious plan to rebuild New York City's old Penn Station to its former glory. For those of you new to the ICAA, we're a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of the classical tradition in architecture, urbanism, and the allied arts. We do this through education, publication, and advocacy. The Institute, our mothership, is headquartered in New York City with 16 regional chapters across the United States. Nationally, the ICAA offers a broad range of education programs, including intensives for architecture and design students, introductory programs for middle school students, lectures and walking tours for the public, continuing education courses for professionals and enthusiasts, travel programs to visit classical masterpieces, publishing of original and reprinted books, and an annual journal entitled The Classicist. Regionally, in addition to providing the education and tours that I just mentioned, our New England chapter hosts the Bullfinch Awards annually. It's occurring this year at the Harvard Club on April 27th. There, we honor the New England's finest accomplishments in traditional and classical design, architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and the allied arts. This year's event will also include keynote speakers from Catsby Lee and David Rao. Please consider joining us for the Bullfinch Awards and our many events throughout the year. Richard Cameron is a principal designer at Atelier Co. in Brooklyn, New York. Atelier is unique in that its goal exists to revive the teaching of the architecture as a fine art in the model of l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Richard is one of the founders of the ICAA, so in a way, our chapter, started only in 2005, is really one of the children of that vision, growing up to spread the original message further. Richard, thank you again for taking your time out of your work schedule to come up to Boston and share the dream that New York might replace the existing sewer that we all know as Penn Station today, and with a reproduction of the original McKim Mead White structure, which opened in 1910. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. And when we started the Institute back in 1992, it was just a group of us in New York who were passionate about classical architecture and thought there ought to be a place for people to get together to talk about it. And the fact that there are now chapters around the country and coming up here this morning, it's sort of incredibly exciting to see all of you here. This presentation today is partly about architecture, but it's also about a much broader set of things. And I'm going to give a disclaimer by starting out saying that I intend to make no political commentary whatsoever today. I'll make the excuse that I'm Canadian and I don't really even have a horse in the game. Although I've been here since 1988, so I should probably think about it. But a friend sent me an article from Cranes this morning. It was an article published a couple of days ago about the Gateway Tunnel project, which I'll talk about a little bit. The whole question of the Penn Station subject is a huge one, and there are so many issues involved with it. And I'm not even going to claim to be an expert. I live in New York. I'm passionate about classical architecture. I had this kind of dream about Penn Station many years ago, and I've been kind of beating the drum ever since, and I continue to. What I hope for is that more people get engaged in the issue, however you come down on the question of what should be done there. It seems to me that not talking, while we talk about a border wall and fight about it all day long and forever and ever, that we're not talking about one of the fundamental things that drives the culture and economy of a country, which is how do you get around, how do you arrive in a place, what's the experience like. So for all the money that's pouring into New York, all the money that's going into the Hudson Yards and the various developments, Billionaires Row, this issue sits in the middle and gets remarkably little conversation. It comes up every once in a while. The governor pops up and makes an announcement about it. But we're talking about, issues that affect everything from strategic interests to the economic interests to the cultural interests of the country. I hope you can see these monitors. Can you see the monitors okay? Because it is a visual presentation, and I was hoping for a gigantic screen behind me so you'd look at that rather than looking at me. But I'll do my best to focus on you and not turn around. Every once in a while I'll turn around and try and point at something. And if you can't see it and need some explanation about it, please feel free to interrupt me, because it's as much a conversation as it is a presentation today. My father, who was a physicist, once sent me a picture from outer space of the lights at night, and he said, what does this tell you about the United States and Canada? Pretty much everything from 60 miles north of the border beyond is kind of dark in Canada, where I come from. We do now have electric light up there, which is kind of a nice thing. But one of the reasons that this is such a kind of big issue for me is that I remember being brought to New York as a 10-year-old to go to Europe by boat, which is a great privilege as a child, and brought down by my grandmother to arrive in Grand Central Station. And I remember the experience of kind of walking out into that and looking up and seeing that astonishing ceiling. It was really the first time I'd ever experienced a building like that, and I think it probably changed my life. That, including traveling to Europe. But this slide is really up just to kind of focus on the fact that there is this. Sorry, go back a second there. Along the Northeast Corridor, this concentration of people, like it or not. The Northeast Corridor is probably one of the most important economic, cultural zones. It's certainly in the country, and if not in the world. And that this route, which I rode half of today from New York up to Boston and down to Washington, is one of the critical things. And at the center of it, we have this major issue. So when this is a map, this is the 1811 Commissioner's Plan of New York, and it's probably a little difficult for you to see. But one of the things about it that's striking is that it shows New York City, the island of Manhattan, basically gridded out from south to north with development sites. So from early on in its history, in a way, New York always had this very utilitarian, certainly the people that were interested in making money, which is, arguably most New Yorkers are there in some ways to do that, at least in part, although people claim to come there for culture as well. But the people who seemed to control the development of the city, had this vision of just taking every lot in the city and parceling it out and selling it off. And of course, the miracle that effectively transformed it was this. That when Central Park was carved out of that, and people, didn't believe that this could be a possibility. Imagine today if you said the same thing. Somewhere in the center of the city, we're going to take some, 40 blocks, and we're just going to turn it into a park. People would say it's completely impossible. And I always like to use this as a kind of example when people say to me, "Well, Richard, aren't you completely dreaming about the idea of rebuilding Penn Station in the middle of New York City?" And I said, but for this dream, New York would be uninhabitable. That, in effect, it would be this appalling grid of streets going from north to south. There would be no relief. And there would, we have a dearth of public squares, and although some of it's getting a little bit better in terms of pedestrian things, this is the thing that makes it possible, which is why all the billionaires are lining up to live there in these new tall towers that are being along Billionaires Row. All right. Here's the Northeast Corridor that I was talking about. That's the slide I was looking for. And this is a kind of one of these things is not like the others piece of the presentation. So I'm going to try and get everyone excited about this as an emotional point of view. But along the Northeast Corridor, we still have a series of these wonderful historic train stations that, regardless of whatever else has gone, are the experience of arriving. So you all know them, I'm sure, very well, traveling by train. But I put them up as a series of images. This is D.C. As you know, it's great. Union Station, Baltimore, where my brother lives, this beautiful Pennsylvania Station with its charming waiting room interior, even Little Wilmington, which has gotten a bit of an unfortunate addition made to it recently, Philadelphia 30th Street Station. When I first met Eric Down, who's involved here, I was commuting from Princeton down, and I would arrive into the great waiting room at 30th Street every morning. It was always one of those wonderful experiences to arrive into. It was being renovated, actually, at the time, still functioning. South Street, which I missed on the way up. I got out of Back Bay by mistake, and then you had the the pleasure, at least, of seeing the great Boston Public Library across the street, which was kind of a nice thing to greet me arriving in Boston. But at least has its historic exterior. And then we have this. And I mean, that's such a setup. It's almost, but it does kind of make the point that we all know that this is what we have in New York. And not only is this what we have, but that's not the experience of what we have. What the experience of what we have is that. So the busiest transit hub in the country, whether it's the most important isn't really an issue, but it is certainly at the center of this whole complex. I was through there this morning at 6 in the morning. It is depressing and at the height of rush hour on any given day, it's arguably terrifying and dangerous, right? I mean, you're trapped in this underground. One of the things that comes up, and I'm sure will come up during questions, is well, what are you going to do about Madison Square Garden? And in fact, that's my exact response to that is, what are we going to do about Madison Square Garden? Madison Square Garden's already moved 4 times in its history. I think it's about time for a 5th move. Where will it go? Anywhere but here, I think is the point, right? Like anywhere. In the river, at the Port Authority, which we should tear down anyway, in Queens. I mean, the Dolans who own it, of course, don't want to move it because this is an economic engine like very few others, right? Imagine you get to park your sports stadium right on top of all the transit hubs and make everybody come up through it and go to the games and buy all the stuff, and But if you know the neighborhood, I'm going to try hard not to fall. I keep wanting to reach forward. If I pitch off here, someone will come to my rescue. All right. So what did we lose when we plunked that thing down there? Again, I'm sure the history of this is well known to many of you, but I'd like to review it before we get into the kind of practical side of the presentation, which is, how would you go about doing this? And again, and one of the things I should say, by the way, this is a project that's being sponsored by the National Civic Art Society out of Washington, D.C. Justin Schuba, who's the president, and the National Civic Art Society the society exists to kind of promote the classical tradition in cultural affairs more broadly, as well as just architecture. And I'm very grateful for that support of this project. They've gotten behind it. They're raising money for it. They're constantly trying to advocate for it. And one of the things that's sort of critical to this is understanding what it is that we lost in order to try to understand what it is we might try to recover, and then ask ourselves whether or not we're interested in doing that as a culture. There are other places that have put great resources and time and energy into doing things like this, so it's not unprecedented. These 3 men were really the visionaries behind the original station in New York. On the left, Alexander Cassatt, who was a Philadelphian. One of the arguments that's made about the sort of failure, ultimately, if you want to call it that, of Penn Station, I'd like to think that not as a failure, but as a momentary lapse in judgment on the part of the people in control of the city, but is that the people who created it weren't New Yorkers. Cassatt was a Philadelphian, McKim was from New England. But Seth Low, who gets left out of the picture, was the visionary mayor of New York at the time. Low Library at Columbia is named for him. He really fought for this and fought, the sort of embedded forces of Tammany Hall and the developers and so on. And it was a fight. Those of you that are interested, Jill Johns' book called Conquering Gotham is it's an amazing read. It reads like a kind of economic thriller about the whole undertaking of creating the station, both the infrastructure project, which far dwarfs the architectural project, and also the vested interests that fought against it, from the Grand Central Railway to the developers to the people developing the private subway lines. It's the constant fight in New York, and the fact that they accomplished this gives me hope that one could potentially accomplish something like this again. So this is an image, I don't know if you can see it very well, of the real project, in effect. The reason that Cassatt was criticized for spending the money and taking the time to build something as grand as Penn Station, but one of the reasons that he did it was that he was trying to make this really pharaonic project of building these tunnels, particularly under the Hudson River, which is one of the most challenging rivers in the world. It's silt and it goes way, way down, very difficult to tunnel under, very dangerous. Many people died in the creation of the tunnels. Far more money. He almost bankrupted the Pennsylvania Railway Company, which was at the time, on the order of like Apple today or Amazon. I mean, it was the most valuable company, arguably, on earth. He had to go to Europe. His sister, Mary Cassatt, of course, the famous painter, lived in Paris, and he made periodic trips to Europe to see her, but also to convince European financiers to help pay for the project, to continue to fund the Pennsylvania Railway and to keep this going. And it was really his vision and the Pennsylvania Railway's vision, Charles McKim, who convinced him to turn Penn Station into what it became, and then Seth Low, the mayor of the city. This was the kind of vision that they had, and I'll just talk about it briefly, but it was a kind of vision of, sort of argue, like Paris and Rome on the Hudson, which was a lot of the vision of the Beaux-Arts in general. This is an aerial view of the site as they envisioned it developing. They eventually sold the site of the, I'm sorry, this is not showing up very well. Anyway, sold the site that became the post office building in order to keep funding the station. The station, Penn Station site itself, and then they envisioned this extending all the way over to Broadway with a whole series of arcades and public spaces and so forth. So it was a really grand urban vision. Again, something that New York really fundamentally lacks. I mean, if you think about, think of any of the other great cities you can think of, there's never really been that kind of thing. And I think that that's one of the failures of this project, was that it cost so much. It was so difficult, and it stressed the company behind it. And the Pennsylvania Railway Company wasn't really a development company, and people have argued that that was their failure of vision in a way. They were also being fought by some very serious vested interests who constantly were kind of ahead of their efforts trying to thwart them because they saw them as an economic competitor. So once the station was built, their vision for the neighborhood, which is what this drawing is about, was never really completed. And that's why it was built in arguably the worst neighborhood in the city, in the Tenderloin, and it never really became fully what they envisioned, which was a kind of version of the Rue de Rivoli around the station. And my argument would be, if we're going to bring it back, we should bring back that as a level of vision. I know that sounds ambitious, but again, on the order of Central Park, unless New York has things like that, it remains this kind of grid of economic diagram rather than an actual city to inhabit. There it is from the air. That's a view from the old Gimbel's store, which so you can look down on it. This is the great 7th Avenue facade with the long, beautiful shopping arcade that connected from 7th Avenue back to, for those of you who don't know it, to the great waiting room. I'll talk about the individual components in a couple of minutes. And there's the plan of it, for all the architects in the audience. So there's the 7th Avenue facade, the long, great arcade. This whole section of the station was really a gigantic kind of circulation system in order to bring it out to 7th Avenue. There was no subway connection over on 8th Avenue. It took almost 20 years for there to be a subway connection over on 8th Avenue, so you had to connect the site. But and people have said, well, what a waste, you've just got all this extra space that you're giving away, But of all the luxuries one could have in New York, right, having that kind of additional space is exactly what you want to have, right? When they again, I'll talk about the numbers a little bit later, but when they started out, the number of travelers was, on the order of something like 20 million passengers a year or something like that. They really planned it for the order of sort of 100 to 200 million passengers a year, thinking way ahead. If you think of that aerial view of their overall vision for this site, in a city that they knew was going to become as dense as New York. I mean, McKim may have been anti-skyscraper, but they all knew at some level that New York was going to continue to concentrate people and therefore have to go up. I mean, even McKim Mead White ultimately designed some tall buildings, many of them very fine. So the fact that this building had these vast spaces was really a kind of visionary thing, rather than it was criticized at the time for being kind of wasteful. So typically puritanical, right, kind of take on a building like that you would consider building one of the grandest rooms in the world a wasteful thing. It turns out that it was a very useful thing to have thought through, and it's exactly what we suffer from now, both at the track level and at the experiential level of the train station. And this is the vision that McKim had in his head. And in fact, there's a famous trip that they all took, Cassatt and McKim and a group of other people, to Rome to go and visit buildings before this got underway. I mean, Cassatt was a CEO of a company and was an engineer and was, although he was a wealthy man, was relatively parsimonious with the company's money. And there are wonderful studies where he actually compelled McKim to create hotel towers over the site of the original building and do all sorts of other things to try and make the cost of the thing go down. And McKim, of course, took him to Rome, took him to St. Peter's. They had a picnic in the Baths of Caracalla. They probably drank a lot of wine. I was just in Colonial Williamsburg, and someone was talking about how after a long and one lunch, John D. Rockefeller took a walk, which he claimed was the most expensive walk of his life, when he was taken to the site of the tavern that had become the site of his fraternity, and agreed to fund the rebuilding of Williamsburg in Virginia. And I can imagine Cassatt coming back from Rome and thinking to himself, what did I just agree to do in the middle of New York City on top of this thing that's almost already bankrupting the country? Anyway, and that's the vision that they drew up based on those great colonnades of St. Peter's on 7th Avenue. I'm sure you can't read it. There's a wonderful quote here from Stanford White about returning to New York after the experience of Europe and seeing this vision kind of growing on the banks of the Hudson. And there, of course, is the wonderful entryway to the 7th Avenue entrance that you went in down 31st Street. The interior, of course, was modeled on both the Roman Pantheon and on the great baths complexes. In fact, the height of the great waiting room was exactly the height of the Pantheon, which was a kind of module. It's interesting, I discovered some years ago that it actually has a biblical origin. The dimension is actually 100 cubits. It was the forecourt of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and it became a kind of dimension that was carried through great classical buildings over time. And so again, that was sort of embedded in this building. The height is exactly the height of the Roman Pantheon. The length is the length of the great Tepidon of the Baths of Caracalla. Two wonderful renderings of it, and then one of the original design drawings showing it in its kind of bright, beautiful, lit, pristine effect. And of course, that's the experience of it, the sunlight pouring through those great thermal windows. Really, as one of my friends said, an outdoor space on the inside. Look at the lighting on the inside of it. It's really street lighting, right? The scale of it is a kind of enclosed outdoor space, really a kind of covered over piazza at the center of the city. And again, yeah.
I just, maybe you're going to address this, but at this point I'd like you to...
One second. I'm sorry.
At this point I'd like you to address what I've heard, which is that the entirety of Grand Central Station could be fit into the waiting room of
I'll show you
the Penn Station.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Can I show you in just a second with a visual? You're anticipating the argument by a few slides, but it's wonderful because that's exactly. I don't know where you heard that, but I heard that too, and then we tested it out, and so some more shots of that interior. This is the space that organized your whole experience of that site. And the failures of the station were many. I won't sort of soft pedal that. I mean, and there are many reasons for that. The whole 8th Avenue side of the station was very underdeveloped. The entrance was kind of fairly underwhelming. People say to me, do you really imagine just rebuilding the station exactly as it was? And the thing I would say initially is, well, no. I mean, because first of all, it's going to be a new building anyway. I think you could imagine all sorts of ways of rebuilding this, but I would rebuild this room for sure, the way that it was. And I'll get to your question in a second, David. For many reasons, but most of which is because, rather like Grand Central, but at an even more extraordinary level, where else are you going to find something like this? I mean, even the great European train stations don't have rooms like this. And that's the thing where, McKim took those original models, grafting the ancient Roman model of public space onto this new transportation model, and really created something very new and very unique. I mean, I don't know, maybe other people know, I don't know any other space on Earth that was like this one. And it would be an astonishing act of cultural occasion. So to get to your point, Grand Central Station, which was my initial experience, and I was truly in awe of that as a 10-year-old kid arriving out from the trains up, seeing that amazing ceiling. And this was, okay, I'll really date myself down, this was 1970, so it hadn't been restored to its glory. It was a little grimy, but it was still an astonishing and extraordinary experience. What is the relationship, aside from the initial competitive relationship between the two stations? And by the way, people have also said to me, well, why do we need Penn Station? We've got Grand Central. And, I don't know how to answer that question other than to say we used to have both and we should again. But, you all know that marvelous interior. It is extraordinary. It is very beautiful. There's the relationship. I don't know if you can see that or not. We made this drawing in the office. That's Grand Central Station sitting inside the waiting room at Penn Station. So you could fit, not in the width, but in terms of the elevational height of the building, the whole of Grand Central Station would fit comfortably under the vaults of Penn Station. Now, what I will do, because I was just talking with John Tittman and some other people about Zemper this morning before the talk, I will say that there is an aspect to Penn Station which I think would need to be carried forward, which is that it was hugely underdeveloped ornamentally, and I think there was a kind of I don't want to say inherent Puritanism in that, but one of the great joys of arriving into Grand Central is looking up and seeing that astonishing decorated ceiling with all of its kind of iconography. It's emblematic of the heavens, all those sorts of things. Penn Station, aside from the wonderful maps that were painted on the wall, was pretty spare. And while some of us might admire that kind of thing, I think it could have used some decoration. So one of the great opportunities we would have in rebuilding it is to rethink that ornamental program potentially. I don't know that we'd have a better budget than they did when they originally built it, but you can imagine that putting some gilded stars up in the coffering might be a nifty thing to do to kind of refer to the rebuilding of a lost building. Anyway, this was of course the view from the concourse when you arrived in on the trains, and this is what happened starting in 1963. Did anyone go through Penn Station? I don't want to have you claim your age or anything like that, but I was old enough, I just wasn't taken there, but people do remember going through it, and most people who remember it today remember it in its rather sad late stage, with that horrible wing that they put in the middle of it, the escalators up the main staircase. These were all sort of desperate measures in an attempt to try to save a failing company rather than to really think through, how would you bring the building up to date. But these are the shots from the beginning of the thing. I remember Alan Greenberg giving a talk for us in New York, talking about arriving in the U.S., coming to Yale, and going down practically every weekend because the destruction of the station had started right as he arrived in New York, just to see it, and take pictures of it. There's a marvelous record of it, photographic record of it. These are just some of them. The eagles, which are now, in Central Park Zoo and a bridge in Philadelphia and various random places. There are bits and pieces. We even discovered a rather obscure piece that I'll show you in a minute for our project in a courtyard out in New Jersey. Lots of this is sitting under the marsh and the meadowlands out in New Jersey, along with various mobsters and other people that we dig up. But it took 4 years to take the building down. They had to jackhammer all of the extraordinary pink Milford granite off the walls of the building, take down all the steel, all of the cast iron, all the plaster, all of it, and meanwhile keep the station functioning. People have asked me, well, how would you rebuild the station? Look at it, it's so busy. And I said, well, they managed to demolish it while everyone was still coming in and out of it. They basically built a kind of a structural deck and kept everyone underneath. The good thing now is at least you could look forward to something better on the other end of it rather than the other way around when it was being demolished in the first place. This is my then 3-year-old son mourning over one of the remnants of the station, which is out, if you care, out in the Brooklyn Museum. If you go out to the back of the Brooklyn Museum, another great unfinished McKim Mead White project. This is one of the Ionic columns from the minor colonnade. I said, there's reason for hope, Alistair. So he asks me every morning when he gets up to go to school. He's now 7. He's like, have they rebuilt Penn Station yet, Dad? And I go, well, not yet. And he's like, oh, Dad, are they going to do it? I'm like, well, it may be your project one day. I'm just out there, in the wilderness. So one of the big questions that gets asked to me a lot is, why would we do this, and can we do this? I mean, really, I don't know why it seems like such an impossible task. Other people have managed to do this kind of thing, at an even grander scale. And this is the one, and I'll admit I haven't even been able to go here yet. So this is on my bucket list for sure, to go to Dresden. And I'm not going to go through a long history of it, but the great Saxon capital and the Dnieper, was, of course, firebombed to the point that everything burned, right? It burnt, the stone burnt in the city. And this is, this makes it look better than it was. It was basically a city of ash, right? Had they dropped an atomic bomb on it, it couldn't really have been much worse. The whole city caught on fire. Using money from this country, by the way, largely, I actually talked to one of the people who's a wonderful scientist at Rockefeller who was involved in helping fund this. I don't know if you know that, but there was a great deal of money that was raised for this project here in the United States. There's another picture of it. And you can't read the quotes, but these are two quotes from one from Frank Lloyd Wright and one from one of his mentors talking about the fact that the bombs didn't do enough, that they should have destroyed more of the historic architecture so we could have built more new modern stuff. I couldn't disagree more emphatically. But this is what Dresden looks like today. Have any of you been there to see it? I'm envious if you have. Yeah. I don't know. People have said, it's Disney. It's what I don't think so. Actually, it's quite the opposite. They literally rebuilt this out of the rubble and the ash, and it is now one of the most visited sites in Europe. People go to see it. People. My modernist friends sort of hate this, but this stuff is really popular. It turns out. A lot of people go to Williamsburg, Virginia for the same reason. And it's not because it's a nostalgic thing. I think it's because this was an extraordinarily beautiful place that was destroyed and has now been recreated by contemporary people. People, we dress like this now, but we built a city that, people used to walk around in powdered wigs, and we don't find it completely contradictory that we do that. We might look better if we all walked around in powdered wigs and high heels again. I don't know. That's another argument. But there's the great Friedrichskirche in Dresden. I don't know if you can see on the slide, they actually went as far as to take pieces of the original building that they could recover and put it back into the building. So the dark pieces that you see are the fire-burnt stones that they recovered. It was an amazing act of three-dimensional reconstruction because they had to locate each of those pieces, then fit them into the building. So, can it be done? It's sort of a simple answer, but yes, of course it can be done. And I would argue that might be an interesting thing to think about in terms of a rebuilt Penn Station, is to recover all the pieces of it that we could and reincorporate them into a rebuilt building. Warsaw, sort of similar story, one of the great Bellotto paintings of the city. Ash and ruin. And again, there you can see it rebuilt at the center. So, and by the way, I'm not alone in this project, although I sometimes feel a little bit like I am. There are other people who are involved in this. There's a wonderful list that actually I think Justin has that lists all of the places that have done kind of rebuildings like this around the world. There's an interesting project going on in Berlin right now at the Royal Palace where they're rebuilding the exterior of the building. The interior is going to be modern. Could you do that to Penn Station? Yes, I wouldn't, but there are lots of ways of approaching this kind of subject, and I'll get into a little bit of the the sort of technical side of it. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any point again. I know Russia's a sore subject these days, not to hold up the Russians as an exemplar. God forbid, they're trying to take over our country. They took over Canada long ago, by the way. That's I'm actually. But this is the Great Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which I actually have seen. This is what happened to it under Stalin. It was blown up and demolished. It was turned into this. The largest outdoor swimming pool in the world. People were afraid to go swimming in this. They thought it was cursed because you could swim in and get hit by lightning. I think it was they built this gigantic outdoor swimming pool. You'd think they would just try and clear the pool when there was a bad thunderstorm, but anyway. And in the 1990s, when Russia was barely crawling off its knees, they managed to rebuild the entire building using brand new material, all of the new bronze and stone and so on. It's a remarkable site, and if you ever watch the Easter services from here, it's one of the sites of the recovery of Russian Orthodoxy and so on. I threw Denver in here not because the Denver train station got destroyed, but it has come back to life. I don't know if those of you who have been to Denver. It's a whole different experience arriving in Denver now, right? I've now taken the light rail train into Denver a few times. And it's amazing. You get out of the airport, you get to go through, that flying wing hotel thing. You get on the train, you arrive, and then you get into Denver's Union Station, and you have what's effectively a living room for the city. You go in, there are cafes and stores and so on. You arrive, you literally walk off the train and walk into this. And there you are at the head of 17th Street, right in the center of the city. And I think it's a fantastic argument for the adaptation of a building like this as the kind of space like this. All right. We all have a dream for New York City. I'm just a guy from Canada who came down and experienced a train station and have one. What I'd like to do is pause now and just show you a short video from my friends at Rethink NYC, because in terms of the practical approach to this, there are a whole bunch of issues that I think are fundamental. But certainly the infrastructure, the train issue of this underlies this at a much grander level. And so the argument about architecture, the architectural expression, has to take place in terms of the larger or the more expensive, the more complicated infrastructure project, just as it did in the first place when Penn Station was rebuilt. So if you could play that.
Much of New York's transit issues are focused on Penn Station. Penn Station has two disjointed levels providing access to trains. Both these levels are intolerably crowded due to the narrow platforms below. Narrow platforms cause dangerous overcrowding and lack space for sufficient stairs and escalators. By implementing efficient train movement, discussed in the Rethink NYC plan, half the tracks become redundant. Removing them gives us the space to widen each platform and provide the opportunity to triple the number of stairs and escalators. Now we can quickly move people between the platforms and the concourses, and reduce the overcrowding that characterizes the existing station. Furthermore, by having access on both sides of a train, passengers can exit to one direction and board from another. This further improves flow and reduces stop time. Now we have a fast, safe, and comfortable experience for commuters. While widening the platforms helps with passenger flow in the existing station, we can also simultaneously lengthen the platforms to fully take advantage of Penn's current expansion. The planned Moynihan Concourse can only access the central platforms, but by absorbing the underutilized mail platform below the expansion, we can extend all platforms fully under the proposed Moynihan Station Concourse, as well as allowing more platform access and train capacity. Since our plan does not affect the structural layout of the station, any architectural proposal above ground is feasible. This includes Visan Chakrabarty's proposal to reuse Madison Square Garden as a Great Hall, as well as Richard Cameron's proposal to rebuild the original. We can all agree that the current station is woefully deficient for the needs of the city, but we must also recognize Penn Station needs much more than a cosmetic makeover. Its improvement is also dependent on functional and holistic planning, and that is what Rethink NYC is providing.
Okay, that little video is, yes?
Can you give us a little brief on the subject of how we were able to have the number of trains?
Can you re-ask the question? Just restate the question.
Tracks.
Not trains, tracks.
Okay.
Tracks. So let me just first of all say that that video is courtesy of Jim Venturi and his company Rethink NYC, Rethink Studio, and I encourage you all. You can probably pull out your phones right now if you're bored with the talk and go and look at it right now. But they have a whole series of amazing videos like this on their site. This is one that just addresses the Penn Station site. They are thinking holistically about the whole infrastructure of transportation around the New York City region. They're actually consultants doing work all around the world on infrastructure. They're really quite brilliant. And the main thinking behind this is that if you turned Penn Station into a true through-running station, in other words, if you rethink the organization of the tracks and you don't dead-end trains and then leave them empty and have them have to go and turn around, but turn it as most of the great European stations are now, through-running, you then can reduce the number of tracks running through the station, which means you can then widen the platforms, which means you can then board trains on both sides of trains, as they do now in the European fashion, thereby improving flow and dealing with many more people and opening up without affecting fundamentally the structural system that's in place, which is really the original structure plus the additional structure for Madison Square Garden. That's a very short encapsulated answer for that. But if you're, and you should be interested in this, if you're interested at all, and you know, I would actually encourage you to invite Rethink and Jim and his group up to Boston to come talk about this, because this is not just a New York issue, really. But they've really thought this through very carefully, and it's really quite extraordinary how short-term the thinking is in terms of that, partly because there isn't really a unified thinking about it. You know, Amtrak is kind of thinking about itself, New Jersey Transit is kind of thinking about itself, Long Island Railroad is thinking about itself, Governor Cuomo is always thinking about himself. No political comment. The mayor is always thinking about himself. Yeah.
Let me just
Could you elaborate as to what led to the demise of the original Penn Station?
Well, that's a really good question. It's the first question that came into my mind when I found out about it. Why did this happen? You know, why does it ever happen in a way? I mean, I think it was a combination of factors. You know, you could say that it was an economic issue at some level, because you'd say, well, the Pennsylvania Railway and railways in general were kind of failing. Why were railways failing? Because it was a huge strategic commitment on the part of the United States government towards car transportation, truck transportation, the road system, right? All the money for the infrastructure got poured into creating the highway system and all of that, with it, both its positives and negatives and all of that kind of thing. It was also a kind of failure of vision of the value of a building like Penn Station. You know, as I said at the beginning, when they built it, you know, they were criticized for building this enormous building in the middle of New York, which seemed to have all this redundant space that wasn't really useful for anything. One of the points to be made is that at the time that they imagined it, there were 20-odd million people going through it. There are now 150 to 200 million people going through it on an annual basis, 600,000 people a day. That number is only going to grow. In fact, we desperately need now not only the Moynihan project, which is going into the post office, but Penn Station, the site of Penn Station, to be utilized just in order to think about future development for the next probably 20 to 30 years, let alone the next 100 years, which is probably the scale we should be thinking about. You know, if people had said that about Central Park, there'd be no Central Park, and all of the development around it, wouldn't have happened, and there'd be no public space there. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a good deep one.
Related to that, my understanding is that the real reason that this happened was because it was essentially a private building. It was owned by the railroad. Central Park is not owned by Central Park; it's owned by the city. Grand Central Station had a different vision for that building, and it became adopted by the city, if you will. The library belongs to the city. Right. But Penn Station was owned by the railroad, and the rescue efforts came too late, but essentially they were dealing with a private organization that could do whatever they wanted with that building. And now Madison Square Garden is owned by a private enterprise. How do we change? I mean, the way we change making this building valuable is because it has to be owned by the people.
Yeah,
Exactly a capitalist way of thinking.
Well, I don't know. I mean, right. I mean, public-private ownership. Ultimately, it seems to me. I don't know. Again, I'll my Canadian background, but it has to be a compromise, right, between public and private. It needs to be a cooperative effort, effectively, right? I mean, in the end, that's the truth of any cultural enterprise, right? Is that you need the argument we've had just recently over Amazon, right? What happened in the big incident? Have you guys all heard about what happened in Queens? And the people who fought it and the people who were against it. And what I generally see is people at war with one another, in these arguments. And one might have wondered whether going back to Amazon and saying, maybe there's another way to approach this. Maybe that we're giving you this giant tax credit, you ought to give They used to do this a little bit more. When I first arrived in New York, right, developers used to be forced to create public space, to create, and on the level of, Central Park, obviously that's a gigantic commitment. I mean, imagine convincing a bunch of developers. But, we've been talking to Related, Vornado, Oxford, all of the people who are involved in the site, and part of the problem here is that they each have their own kind of imperial vision of the site. Steve Roth at Vornado kind of thinks, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he thinks about the Penn site as kind of his. He owns the vast majority of the buildings around the site. He's now been kind of tasked with doing the Moynihan redevelopment. Is he cooperating with other people? Yes, but I think he sees this as his kind of legacy project. Again, I don't know. And the problem is it doesn't involve a broader public vision. The new Thomas Heatherwick thing at the Hudson Yards project, whether you love it or not, is the vision of the owner of the company, not a larger public vision. I would argue that the people that originally thought of Penn Station, and this was one of McKim's great roles in this, was to try to get Cassatt to see beyond his corporate interest to a greater public interest, right? To something that and his argument was that the great, buildings of classical antiquity did that as well. Whether they were, commissioned by emperors or, that was the patronage. Ultimately, they had a great public good in mind. Did they have a democratic input into them? I don't know, and that's always a messy process. But anyway, let me go through just some of the rest of the slides here, and then I'd actually love to talk more about some of these issues. This, of course, is Santiago Calatrava's project for the PATH station down in Lower Manhattan. This project cost around $4.5 billion, depending on how you do the math, somewhere between $3 and $4.5 billion. How much of that went into the building of the building? Obviously, $4.5 billion didn't go into building this building, but the commitment on the site was a $4.5 billion commitment. About 45 or 50,000 people a day go through this. So about a tenth of the number of people go through Penn Station every day, and compare the experience. I've been in the building. There are things about it I like. There are things about it I really don't like. It's also leaking. Lots of buildings leak, whatever. I think the biggest problem with it is it's fundamentally like kind of a shopping mall experience. You go inside and it's a bunch of luxury stores, and whatever the sculptural experience of the building, you kind of go like, oh, okay, is that it? But the point about this is that we committed $4.5 billion to rebuilding here, in part because of the emotional impact of what happened down in that site. I wish I could get people to think about the Penn Station site as a similar act of cultural war, that whatever the forces were, to your question, that made it happen, it was an incredible tragedy that occurred on the site of Penn Station, tearing down that building, the loss of the cultural capital, the literal loss of the capital. And not that I would wish that lots of people died in order for people to understand, but all the people that died putting it there in the first place are forgotten about, in effect, because we've just kind of let it go, and there is no talk about this. So that's there to kind of make that point. This is one of the governor's many solutions to the site. He seems to enjoy commissioning projects for figuring out how to slide under Madison Square Garden. So this one I love because it looks like an upside down skateboard park. This is the 8th Avenue facade that SOM did, sort of showing how wouldn't it be wonderful to have a big glass facade that you still have to creep under the belly of Madison Square Garden to get down to the train from. I don't know. This is like putting lipstick on. Well, whatever. And very much like the solutions they have to the various entrances to the station now from the new pedestrian plaza. Plunk a skylight on it, and all will be well. Right. I don't know. Maybe first year architecture school, you could get away with something like that for a while. It doesn't seem to me to be a solution. This is a remarkable one by Bjarke Ingels and Big, which he apparently has dubbed the Maryland, where this is actually 2 Penn Plaza, which is the tower on the 7th Avenue facade. And he did a proposal for Vornado, for Steve Roth, to reskin the building and basically lift the skirt of the building as if it was blowing up in the air. So again, you could get glass and light, and but begs the question again, is this really the entrance to the train station? It might be, remarkable and shocking for a minute or two. This one I love because I sometimes put this slide in upside down and you can't tell the difference. This is, and that's a compliment, by the way. I'm a sci-fi fan. I think this would be a fantastic space station. This is Diller, Scafidio, and Renfrew's proposal. The Municipal Art Society a few years ago did a competition for a new Penn Station, and this was their thing. You could skateboard all over this. I mean, it really is something. And this is the fairly recent one, a couple of years old now, of Vishaan Chakrabarty. He's given a TED Talk about this. You can see quite ingenious, actually, this idea of taking Madison Square Garden, pulling out the arena inside it. So this also assumes moving Madison Square Garden. He didn't also say where to put it, but I'm sure he's got some good ideas. He's working on a big project out in Queens now, so maybe he'd want to put it there. I don't know if he's going to convince the Dolans. We were naughty. We put I call it the glass donut. So we put a giant Krispy Kreme. You can't see it. Inserted it into the middle of this. This is the giant glass donut as train station. There are many issues one might have with this, including what's the real effect of a building like this on the street level. This giant glass thing. How does it do if there's Anyway, whatever. But as Jim Venturi's video suggests, all of these are potential possibilities. This is kind of this is how I got started on it many years ago when we were first starting the institute. I did this drawing for the cover, which showed this was when Moynihan Station was first being proposed. And it basically just showed the post office building with the ruins of the station in the foreground and the vault of the original waiting room above it. And that was, at that time, I was just thinking about, well, how could you make that waiting room? And then that's when the idea occurred to me, why wouldn't you just rebuild the station? So our logo for this project, and I don't want to go on too long, I'd like to involve you, so I'm going to go through these next slides fairly quickly. This is sitting out in a courtyard in New Jersey. This is the great stone winged hourglass of flying time that we adopted as a logo for this project. It sat in the clock, which was right up above the main entrance. These are some wonderful renderings done by Jeff Stikeman for the National Civic Arts Society that we worked with. This one actually imagines keeping Two Penn Plaza there and rebuilding the colonnade around it. This one shows Jim Venturi's project for the platforms widened and the new escalators and so on in the old concourse. So, of course, with drawings, you can do all sorts of wonderful things. These are a combination of sort of digital and hand drawing. Jeff is very good at that. He's done a lot of wonderful work that way. This one, we actually imagined changing the interior of the Great Hall, opening up the colonnades and seeing if you could get a more open feeling with the building. There are lots of things that are possible. This is when we took the great side colonnades, which were used originally as carriageways for taxis, imagining that wouldn't happen, turning them into wonderful open colonnades for the city, trying to make the building more open. And we ran a series of train ads on the New Jersey transit system. They were up all over the place for a few months, showing these things, trying to get the public interested. That's kind of the goal ultimately is this. There's lots more that I could talk about. I don't want to go on for too long today. I will say there are other people who've been thinking about this. Gene Kaufman did a whole analysis of the development rights on the site, the air rights, if you reverted them. And one of the arguments we've made is if you rebuilt the original landmark building, you could revert the air rights under a legal argument and then transfer those air rights all around the site, building very tall buildings and paying for the whole structure. And it's quite remarkable when you do the math on it. You could probably generate between $5 and $20 billion depending on how you value those things. Air rights are kind of fungible things anyway, right? So, this is a list of all the drawings, the New York Historical Society, they're all still there, including the original shop drawings, which is kind of remarkable. I've been in to see them. So every single piece of this thing, could digitize the whole collection for $20,000 or $30,000, turn it all into BIM software. Can you rebuild a building like this? And, this is 9 West Street that was very badly damaged during 9/11. All this stonework was done out in Utah and panelized and brought in and put up on metal panels very rapidly. Wonderful work done by Historical Arts and Casting, recreating, most recently, the restoring the U.S. Capitol Dome. I throw in the Ralph Lauren store in New York. People say, can you build a classical building in New York City? Well, Ralph Lauren managed to do it, and he's made a great empire out of creating things like this. Other possibilities that Rethink. We thought through some of the issues around the larger urban question, including these wonderful arcades that McKim originally envisioned. Did this with a group of students in New York, or we just gave them free rein to say, well, if you were really going to redevelop around here and rebuild the station, what might you do? So we sketched it out from the air. We plunked the building in a digital way into the site. So that we propose taking down one Penn Plaza and creating an outdoor space like Bryant Park. One of the things that is kind of problematic down there is there's really no outdoor public space really to occupy. And so I think you would also, in developing this, now obviously with Hudson Yards to the west there is, We even did a proposal at the request of Vornado to rethink the Hotel Pennsylvania, which was the largest hotel building built in the country as a series of smaller hotels linked by a kind of European arcade. These are still hanging in their presentation boardroom, although they keep threatening to tear down the building. So every other week, Steve Roth goes on and says he's going to tear it down. What would it look like? That's what it would look like going up if it were being rebuilt again on 7th Avenue. And we'd go from the experience on the left to something like the experience on the right. And we might all walk out of the building one day with our children or grandchildren. Thank you.
It's amazing to think that one of the founders of this organization is here and put on one of the biggest presentations we've ever given. Thank you again so much.
My pleasure.
So we're going to start a question and answer. I'm going to ask that, I'm going to go over, you raise your hand, we need to have it on film. This is being taped right now, and it's going to be loaded onto our website. And if you are on our email list, you'll get an email when you can actually share the link. So does anybody have any questions?
Did I not answer your question, David?
A new question. Follow-up. There was once, I believe, a proposal to put the arena into the Moynihan post office.
Yeah.
What happened to that, and is it still feasible given what's
It didn't quite fit, I think, is the simple answer to it. I mean, you could squeeze it in there, but you would have done a great deal of damage to the historic building, and I think that people ultimately thought. The big problem with Madison Square Garden, let's just be honest, is that the Dolan family, let's just, don't really want to move Madison Square Garden. They only have 6 years, 5.5, something like that, left on their special use permit. By the way, Madison Square Garden exists there under a special use permit. Most people don't know this. They're not there in perpetuity. They, I think they are. And if you had that site, and you started out wherever you did and ended up in the middle of Manhattan, would you want to give it up? It's like the crown jewel of the empire. It generates, all the money that it does.
they'd still be over that.
Yeah. No, that's true. I think it's a terrible place to put it because I think the problem is putting it over top of the. This is why McKim argued with Cassatt about sticking the big hotel tower, which there's a drawing of. He made McKim Mead White make a drawing of that hotel tower, which is like 2 Penn, sitting right over top of the station. And McKim did it grudgingly, and then basically said, Your vision is too small. What you should do is take those tall buildings and put them beside it, not on top of it, so that the experience of the kind of grand one-story building can live by itself effectively, right? And you can get all the trains through it, because if you build buildings over top of it with complex structure going down, you inevitably make it much more difficult for all the transportation issues that occur underneath it. So, I don't know. So anyway, where should it go? I don't think there. I think there are lots of places. I'd stick it out in the river. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. I think it could be kind of wonderful to go to. It'd be some recompense for the Rangers and the other experiences of, the Knicks. You could go out and look at the river and console yourself while you cried again about. Sorry, that was.
Great presentation. Thank you for coming today. On the PBS, there was a PBS documentary that showed how the Hellgate Bridge was actually part of the ensemble.
Yeah.
So I see that bridge very differently now.
Mm-hmm.
It's really quite wonderful.
Yeah, spectacular bridge too. Yeah.
The question is, with the Milford granite quarries, which are not far from here, a half an hour away, would it be practical to reopen those and deploy the original stone for the?
Why not?
I don't know if it's something.
I think.
Nice touch.
No, absolutely. Interesting. Milford granite. I'll make a little kind of counter argument to that. I was. My parents lived in an old farmhouse in the country, and they had to sell the house and move into a town nearby. And I was with my kids wandering through the park there, and there was an outcropping of granite there. And I was like, "That's Milford granite. That's so weird," And I was then on a trip in Sweden. I was walking across the granite. I was looking at it. I was like, "That's Milford granite." You want to know what Milford granite really is? Milford granite is McKim's version of Egypt, taken from effectively what is the Canadian Shield, which is the granite that runs over the top of the globe and crops up in Sweden and Canada and New England and all of these places. So in effect, it's a universal stone. What's the quality of it that's so extraordinary is a kind of a rosy pink color, right? So in the gray, midwinter or whatever, the building has this, when it's clean, has this kind of glow. And when the sun hits it, as it would, particularly during Manhattan Henge, right? It turns kind of like color of the sun. And McKim's vision for this was very much of ancient buildings, the ancient Roman buildings, but even more importantly, things like the Temple in Jerusalem, and in particular the great Egyptian granite buildings, which of course were related to that cosmography. Right? So think of the I always try to think of it, in this sort of phoenix-like way as glowing at sunrise or sunset with this pink color. But would it be great if you got it from Milford again? Sure. I wouldn't bring it from Sweden, but these days people might.
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation, which was just wonderful. From the Rethink NYC video that you showed, it's pretty clear that the present construction there is not adequate to get past, and something's going to get built there. So what do you think the forces are that will keep it from being or might keep it from being a somewhat more contemporary act of desecration, and how can we contribute?
How can we contribute? Well, I have a little bag for some money. No, I'm kidding. I mean, do consider supporting the National Civic Art Society in New York, because they're the ones who are helping. And I know that Justin is constantly out, banging the drum, trying to raise money. One of the things that we want to do, and not to make it a money issue, but if if you can't keep some of the money to keep paying for doing things, I think doing some really great digital reconstructions of this, which we're actually at work on right now and are trying to raise the money for, would be really a fabulous way to make this argument, and also make more videos like the Rethink one that would show people what are the alternatives. Show them. You could show any number of those projects, right? I'd put it to a vote personally. I mean, if I could, part of the reason we ran the train ads, we raised some money and we paid for those ads to be on the train series, was just to try to get people interested in the subject and to say, well, could we have a voice in this? One of the really sad things recently, I don't know if you've noticed it, they used to have pictures of the old Penn Station up in Penn Station. They're gone. Right? They'd replaced all those photographs with digital advertising boards, and they didn't have the decency to even put, even scrolling through some pictures of the old station there. So the history is being erased, in effect. And I think one of our main jobs is to try and keep it out there, so that people could at least, I mean, look, do we live in a democracy or not? So what would be wrong with letting people vote on it? What if we built a fabulous 3D print of the original station large enough for people to stick their heads in, put it right in the middle of Penn Station, and said, vote on your new station?
Voting doesn't always work out so well.
No, I know. Populist votes are a dangerous thing. I know the Roman emperors would agree with you completely. I get it. But it would be nice though to have it be part of the dialogue. Like if you talk to most people about Penn Station now, certainly people under 40 or whatever, it's lucky if they've heard of the original Penn Station. And again, there are lots of alternatives, and there are even alternatives of taking pieces of it and adapting it. I'm not saying this is the only solution.
Justin Shubo was a guest of ours 2 years ago for our Bullfinch Awards, and we have an amazing lecture online. So if you just go to our website, you'll find it. It's about an hour long, and he really talks about the government buildings and how they've changed over the last 100 years. He's an amazing orator.
I think this particular subject, although I've spent my life and career being, interested in doing classical architecture, this is sort of, I try to focus the argument less on that in this case, because I think it's really about, rather like those images I showed of Dresden or Warsaw or so on, I like to think of this as kind of almost like economic war damage or whatever, cultural war damage, and that wouldn't it be extraordinary if this country just took a site like this and said, rather than like they did in Williamsburg, we're going to recreate this building in this place. It'll work, it'll function as a train station, but we can also do this. We could recover something like this, and say it was a mistake, in fact, to take it down. That to me is the core argument, anyway.
Right here.
Yeah.
Hello, Richard.
Hey. Hi.
Good to see you again.
You too.
Instead of putting posters up of what Penn Station looked like, or once want you to look like, what's the possibility of collecting all those pieces of the old station and bringing it to the station so that as people come through it, they can actually...
Well, I mean, no, it's a good idea. There are actually pieces. One of the eagles is set out rather unceremoniously, plunked down beside 2 Penn Plaza on 7th Avenue. No one ever notices it because it's completely lost in the kind of the chaos. I don't know. I mean, you could do lots of things. You could, we've thought of giving out, 3D goggles and letting people do a virtual reality walkthrough. You could have pieces of the actual building. I think you might be hard pressed to convince, like the Central Park Zoo and Philadelphia, to give back those pieces unless there was a genuine effort to re-put them back on the site. It's kind of like the argument over the Parthenon, the pieces of the Parthenon sculptures and so on. Going back to the original site. I think personally that it would be marvelous to reunite the pieces of the building in a rebuilt building. Do you have to do that? No, you could recreate them and leave the pieces that are there in sight. And there are again lots of different approaches to this. But for those of you who know Penn Station well, that area that you come out into that's that kind of weird circular rotunda is effectively the center of the great waiting room. That'd be a perfect place for an exhibition of some of this kind of stuff.
Thank you for the presentation. I love your vision of the station, and I guess I'm curious about 2 things. What kind of traction did you get from the advertising you did in the New Jersey Transit, from those posters? How did you collect the reactions? And then I'm just curious what you think the next steps are, and if there's a chance of this happening anytime soon.
My son asks me that every morning. I think he's worried about the amount of time I dedicate to it, frankly. No, he was really genuinely upset when he found out that what the building looked like and when it was lost. As little kids tend to be, they're just sort of like, I was reading that there's a wonderful children's book on the station. I don't know if you've seen it. It's got all these lovely illustrations. I was reading it to my 5-year-old the other night, and he was just like, "Why did they take it down? Why did they?" It was a question, why did they take it down? I don't really have a good answer for him. Well, it was a series of economic and cultural. We are a group of people who are passionate about the subject. We didn't, there was a kind of bump in interest or a bunch of articles and so on that happened. But in the current time, unless you keep it out there constantly and are out on the web and doing things, and what we really need is a really big celebrity to get involved in this and just say, this is my issue, right? The way Jacqueline Kennedy did, around landmarks and so on. I mean, after all, we wouldn't have Grand Central Station had it not been for people like her in particular, her getting involved in that, becoming passionate about it. And we almost lost Grand Central, as you know, right? I mean, it was a very close thing. So, and they're still trying. You could, right? Right. It's kind of hanging in there, but and again, that kind of capital, that's the cultural capital that we have now, right? Because the celebrity can magnify that kind of voice, and so that would be a great thing to have happen, Analytics, web, all of the rest of it, doing a serious modern marketing campaign. We'd love to run ads on the other trains, get a much bigger web presence, get a really good, digital visualization of what all this might look like and how you might adapt it, get other people interested in the dialogue and conversation.
So let me ask you something very important. What's your hashtag?
Rebuild Penn Station. But again, it's in terms of even numbers of views on. There was a wonderful piece done by Ovation TV, and it got, I think, a couple 100,000 people watched it, and it talked about this effort and project. But in the contemporary moment, a couple 100,000 people is like a drop into nothing. Unless you're getting 30 million views on YouTube now, you're not. And we're not going to get 30 million views for this unless people see it for what it is, which is, I think, one of the central, economic, cultural, strategic, issues that faces certainly at least New York, but I would argue the country. Think about how much coverage the wall gets on any given day.
You actually answered my question because I was thinking there needed to be a national icon who took up this cause, like Jackie Kennedy did. I remember that really well when they were about to tear down Grand Central. And I might also remember the rebuilding of underneath when they were taking down Penn Station.
Mm-hmm.
We were kids, and we would sneak into New York City from the suburbs, and it was like a house of horrors or a fun house because there are all these ramps, plywood, and places to go, and it was not as unaffected down below as you might have thought. It was really
Yeah, I wish Oprah would take this up. I mean, she'd be whatever. Again, it would be a great issue for someone like her to, just kind of take up as a cause and say, this, because I mean, again, you could argue about the social value of it, but I think that the thing about buildings like this is that everyone from the billionaire who might have a penthouse overlooking it to the homeless person. Jim Venturi tells a wonderful story about his mother, Denise Scott Brown, talking about how whenever it rained, all the people in the neighborhood would go into the great waiting room at Grand Central Station or at Penn Station and take shelter, from the weather. And, that's a public good of the kind that transcends economics and everything else, right? So.
I imagine that it's possible that not 100% of the people in this room have heard Vincent Scully's great quote. Could you repeat that quote?
You could, please. We used to scuttle in like, we used to enter New York like gods, and now we scuttle in like rats. Yeah, scurry in like rats. Yeah, that one. Right. What do I think that means? That we ought to think about coming back in like gods.
I was struck by your comment that this Madison Square Garden is special use permit is going to expire in 6.5 years. Was that special use permit given by the City of New York, the planning and zoning authorities? And if so, are they at all interested in what you're doing?
Well, one of the things that gets argued a lot about the site is who owns it. The special use permit is, a part of the city, but then Governor Cuomo seems to think that he owns New York City. I don't know what the state government does. The federal government, obviously, with Amtrak, has Vornado now thinks they seem to own the site. This is part of the problem, and inevitably, I think one of the dangers in it is that there's always the threat of litigation, right? You could spend decades arguing that in courts, and again, that would get us nowhere because nothing would happen. I think unless, and by the way, in this I mean I include like the Dolans and Vornado and related, got together and said, oh no, we really need something very special here, not just our thing and their thing and our, they've tried that with Moynihan, and I think Moynihan will be a real success when it's done. It'll certainly help an awful lot, but it won't recover what we had. It won't adequately answer all of the transportation issues for sure. It leaves all of the 7th Avenue, things unanswered. And it doesn't. So it doesn't. Again, it's not a grand enough vision. It's not a vision on the order of Central Park, which is what I try to argue with the opening of this presentation is what we need really in New York.
Wouldn't you argue that the High Line is exactly that in a smaller scale?
Yeah.
You go up that stairway,
for sure.
You see that list of patrons that started that ambitious project and basically rejuvenated an entire part of the city.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yes, and it's probably the best precedent we have in New York for something like that. Yeah, for sure.
Questions?
One more.
Another practical question. You mentioned the Moynihan, that's the renovation of the post office.
Yes, right. Sorry, yeah, it's named for Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
So has that been perceived at all as a potential phase one? Is that something that could precede the?
I like to argue that it's phase one.
That it would be phase, and then the recreation of so that could happen first.
It's happening now.
And
It's going on now.
Bring benefit, and then this would be phase two.
Right.
Right. I see.
Phase 3 for me would be taking down 1 Penn and 2 Penn and putting an outdoor, and you laugh, but
No, I think that's
right. If you have a vision for what think about that part of the city. Think about how, I work around it. How congested, how impossible, how could we use another Bryant Park in the middle of that? I think so.
Well, lastly, I applaud your effort, and I know it's preaching to the choir, but I think that if you're successful, this is going to raise the expectations of the general public, and I think that's a big problem. I mean, Boston's booming, but we're seeing lots of glass curtain wall and ceramic rain screen, and it's just we need a project like this as a catalyst to change the disposition of the general public and raise our expectations. So thank you.
Well, thank you again to the Boston Design Center for hosting us. This has just been an amazing morning. Join us for a couple of bites to eat, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, David.